I watched for that TV special for years. In my mind, it's as if it actually happened. So, as I said, I was really always longing for my dad and this big life that I associated with him. And so when I was 15, my mother supported me to go away to college, which was incredible. I got to drop out of high school, which was pretty much the most miserable thing I had ever done being in high school. So I just was thrilled to get this chance to go down to Western Massachusetts in the Berkshires, a couple of hours outside of Boston, and start my college education. But whereas most kids when they're 15 would be like rebelling against their parents and not wanting to spend any time with them, one of the first things I did was call my dad. So I was like, he wouldn't come to me, now I'm gonna go to him. So probably like my second or third weekend in school, some friends took me into Boston for a concert. I knew my dad was in Boston, so I called him. And this is what's happened. Cocky with my newfound independence and a sense of my own maturity and worldliness. 15, you know. I reached out to my dad to let him know I'd be in Boston with some friends for a concert. I'd only seen him once since the Cure concert 2 years earlier, but I still felt close to him because of our letters. Even though I was intent on seeming cool in front of my new friends, I was sure my dad could hang. And as always, I really just wanted to see him. Actually, I wanted to impress him. If I hadn't been able to woo him with the sweet girl I'd been, I would woo him with the wild child I'd become. Because Stephanie was friends with the opening act, we pulled up behind the venue where the bands loaded in their gear. My dad approached, sussed out the situation, and immediately had to get on top of it. He saw a skinhead with braces, bomber jacket, and shaved head, his neatly rolled blue jeans above oxblood Doc Martens. I didn't know you hung out with skinheads, Sarah, he said. There's a lot of ignorance and hatred in that culture. You have to be careful. Not all skinheads are racist, I snapped back. I'm friends with sharp skinheads, and they fight for equality and tolerance. Dad's still fighting. Someone's got to fight for what's right, I said. He stepped back a little, surveyed me and the pack of drinking, smoking kids. You know what? If you don't want me here, I should go, he said. Just like that, I did not want him there. I wanted to be 15. I wanted to drink beer and kiss the cute guy I'd been eyeing from the opening band. I wanted to go up front for the show. I stared back at him, not begging him to stay, for the first time in my entire life, not making everything okay for him. Fine, Sarah, I'm gonna go, he said. Okay, I said, bye. He walked off toward the street. I stood there, stunned. Maybe I hadn't been particularly welcoming, but I hadn't been actively trying to reject him or push him away. I didn't have it in me to want to hurt my dad. I just needed him to acknowledge the sophisticated girl in the big city I'd become, after years of striving, largely out of my desire to be close to him. I hadn't even stood up for myself. I had simply sidestepped my usual role, and by doing so, I had betrayed him. He wasn't walking away like a parent would to give me space. He was reacting out of his own chronic insecurities and issues, and I would not be forgiven. He would not see me again for the next 10 years. So, not long after that, when I was in college, we had a school shooting, which was one of the first school shootings in the country. This was 1992, so it was a few years before Columbine. So I talk about that in the book. When that happened, although my dad was just a few hours away, he never called me to check in and make sure I was okay. I graduated from college, he wasn't there. So I went out to Portland, Oregon for a few years with my then best friend, and then I went back to Boston to go to graduate school, to Northeastern, not Northwestern. And suddenly I was in the same city as my dad for the first time in years, well ever really, since I had been 2. This was the first time we really lived in the same place, and still he didn't see me. It was 9 months. I was like, gosh, he can't even travel like a few miles to see me. So I finally wrote a letter to my dad, and he always said, you know, when I stop gambling, I'll see you. When I get some money, I'll see you. When my back problems are better, I'll see you. And so in my letter I said, don't wait until you're perfect or it'll be too late. If you want to have a relationship with me now, let's try. And we'll see what happens. And he actually heard that, which was incredibly brave of him. And we had lunch together on his 55th birthday. And we started kind of having these dad-daughter days where he would take me whale watching or he would take me to lunch. And it was really sweet and it was really healing. But because my dad remained, I guess an eccentric would be the nice way to say it, we didn't always have your sort of typical days together. So this is one of the days that we spent together in Boston when I was in my mid to late 20s. My father was deeply curious, and our excursions were often a part of his attempts to learn and make sense of, well, everything. On a beautiful autumn day, we met in Central Square, got picnic supplies at the Natural Foods Co-op, and walked over to Mount Auburn Cemetery, where we sat together amid the white birches and marble stones, which were stark against the glowing orange and crimson leaves. Then he decided we should compare the legendary Mount Auburn with the equally esteemed cemetery in my own neighborhood, Forest Hills. I mentioned that Anne Sexton was buried there, and he checked out a library book on the poet. When he rang my bell on the morning of our field trip, I went downstairs to let him in, pausing to hug him, and led him upstairs to my apartment. As I gave him a tour, he looked around in wonder. I was 26, and I shared a 2-story apartment with a spacious living room and kitchen and an extra front room, office, makeout room. My dad was 56, and he lived in one small room in a boarding house with a bathroom down the hall. He was halfway across the warped kitchen floor when he stopped, transfixed by the view of treetops and sky straight ahead. He put both hands out as if to steady himself on a surfboard, bent his knees slightly as if testing the give. Far out, he said. I feel like I'm floating in the sky. It was unclear whether he was having an actual acid flashback or not, but his enthusiasm was infectious. I laughed then, and on the many occasions after that when I walked into the kitchen and pictured him there, caught up in his bliss. We went to my local co-op and got a picnic and set out for the graveyard. As we walked, my dad drifted into a reverie about Anne Sexton, speaking as if he had a crush on her. Never mind that she'd been dead by her own hand for 3 decades by then. She was just incredible, he said. Did you know she had a band? She started it with some of her students when she was teaching. They wrote songs, and she read her poems over the music. I would love to find a recording just to hear what it was like. She was so angry, so unhappy, and so beautiful, too. When we reached her grave, where she was buried with her husband's family, we saw that previous devotees had left a dozen small cones, stacked stones with a beautiful simplicity that moved me. We built one of our own. Then my father surprised me. He reached into the pocket of his cargo pants and pulled out his current notebook. I'd like to read a piece of one of her poems I wrote down, he said. I smiled at him, loving that he'd been inspired to make this gesture of respect. My friends and I, who made such a show of devotion to the bands and writers we loved, would have felt embarrassed to do something so sincere. His voice still had the lazy inflection of the Trenton hoodlum he's been, but it was weathered by the decades in which he longed to be a poet, and when poetry had eluded him, he turned himself toward the puzzle of enlightenment instead. As we walked between graves and stands of ancient trees, I felt closer to him than I could ever remember having been. At the same time, I was incredibly proud of the independence I'd forged at such a great cost, and was wary of a father figure, especially one who had essentially abandoned me for the first 25 years of my life. I dared a sideways glance at him and hoped we would figure it out. So the final little bit I'm going to read about my dad happened just a few years ago. I had moved out to Los Angeles because I fell in love with it really, in California in general, and then just to pursue my writing career. And my dad and I actually talked on the phone a lot when I first moved there. I was really broke, and I found it sometimes hard to be sad in a place where it's really beautiful, because you just feel like such a loser when everyone else is like outside at the beach and you're having a rough time. So my dad didn't have a phone, but he would take a bus from his boarding house where he lived to the subway, and he would take the subway to a payphone at a prearranged time, and he would use a calling card, and he would call me from the payphone and just talk to me for as long as I wanted, hours, about my writing, about boys, about whatever it was that was worrying me. And we grew pretty close during that time. But it was, it was complicated. My dad was, as I said, a little bit eccentric. But this was one of the conversations that we had, which I think is, the central moment of the book, really. One day that summer, I was driving in LA while talking with my father. In the midst of one of his endlessly entertaining monologues, he brought me up short. "You're a good girl," he said. Just like that, tears pressed hard against the backs of my eyes, threatening to spill. Something strange happened in me, like the moment a wall of icicles melts, setting off a cascade of falling ice that's beautiful to behold. You've always been a good girl. Even when you were running around with those boys in the band, you were a good girl, and you're a good girl now. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so does anyone have any questions?
Is your father still alive?
He is, yes.
Do you still see him?
I do. He lives in Boston, so I don't see him as much as I would like, but a couple of times a year, yeah.
Is he married again now?
No, he's not married, but this is sort of typical of my dad. He had several girlfriends after my mom, one of whom was Bavarian. She was living in Boston working as a nanny, and they got pregnant with my sister, and she only lasted about a year. My mom had lasted 2, and my dad was still, gambling, the same stuff. He hadn't changed at all, even though it was 11 years after I was born. So she took my sister back to Bavaria, where her family was and where the social services are much better. And so my sister Esmera grew up there, and I'm actually about to go and see her because she just had her first child. So we're kind of getting to know each other, which is interesting because we have an age difference and a cultural difference, but it's really sweet to have this side of my family, for sure.
Is your father still a gambler?
He is, and it's interesting because it's a little bit embarrassing, but anyone who's had a family member who's dealt with something like this will probably understand. I just always would assume that he had kicked it. And recently we were talking on the phone, and he wanted to make a point about how he was better now. He was trying to convince me to do something or agree with him on something. And he was like, well, because when I said I was better before, I was still gambling. But now I'm not gambling anymore. But it's like that point in time where he has stopped is always moving. And I'm sure in 6 months he'll be telling me, well, when I told you I had stopped before.
You can't trust him anymore.
Yeah, and I've accepted that this is who he is. It's complicated. He has cancer now, and he's treating it himself with, this is all in the book, with herbs that he found on the internet. And so, I worry about his well-being and about his financial well-being, but I also can't give him money. So, I try to help him with essentials that maybe he can't afford.
How old is he now?
He's 69, so he's really young.
That's young.
I know. So that's the thing. I mean, I do hope that, in his own way, he can have a quality existence. And it's funny, he's still, he sort of grew up in a time where the track was sort of romantic, and a lot of writers wrote very beautifully about the track, and he always was a huge Jack Kerouac fan. I mean, to him, Jack was the best, and there's a scene in On the Road where Jack goes to the track. And so my dad still sort of manages to maintain some of that allure, or try to. He still talks about the culture of it, and the jockeys and his friends were there and everything. So
it sounds like your dad was an adventurer kind of type too. So that's probably how he related to Kerouac.
Yes.
It's very expensive to gamble, so does he have a job? How does he get?
No, he's on disability.
So he uses disability?
Yep. And it's complicated. Like many people, he's kind of against disability. So he's doesn't always see himself as clearly as maybe he thinks he does. But that's how he does it.
Yeah. I was really struck by the book. I mean, my father was very different from your father and much more present, but yet I think the emotions in the book of just the push and pull that you go through with your family, I mean, I think that really resonated for me, even though, so it's interesting, I mean, that it's framed as a book about your father, but I feel like it's so much a coming of age book, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about the other aspects of the book that, because it's really, there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, no, it's true. And it was interesting because when I first outlined the book for my editor, and we sat down to talk about it, everything had been through the eyes of my dad, or through the lens of my dad, I should say. And even there was a 5-year period of my life, or 4-year period of my life, when I went to Portland, Oregon, and I wasn't seeing my dad then, and so I wasn't going to write it. And my editor said, well, what did you do there? And I said, well, I fell in love for the first time. I kind of learned to work. I kind of learned to be a writer. And she said, oh, write that. The rest of the book is kind of sad. And I think that you need a couple of happy chapters. But it was very telling that just because my dad wasn't in the story, it didn't seem important to me. And this was even just a few years ago that I was writing the book. I still really had to kind of topple him off the pedestal I had put him on. So she was really reminding me, it's your book, you know, and yes, it's a story of you and your dad, but it is your coming of age as a writer, as a person. And I think it was really important to me that the book not end with my dad and I reconciling our relationship, but the book had to end with me coming to terms with my own sense of myself. And so really I was thinking a lot about, well, what does it mean to be a good girl? You know, it was very important for me to hear that from my dad, but obviously I have to make up my own definition of that. And so I really wanted to write a lot also about my educational experience, because it was very unusual to get to go to school at 15, but it was incredible. It changed my life. I mean, the shooting was obviously incredibly devastating, but it's something that's, you know, more and more prevalent in our culture. I think it's really important to write from experience, to try to share that with other people. And then I was a music journalist for a long time, as you talked about in the introduction, and I love music. So I wanted to kind of write about what it was like to live in a couple of different music communities at the time I was writing about them. And also, you know, I've always been trying to kind of figure out how to be an artist, and I was always really drawn to like Patti Smith or her book, or even, you know, books about Joni Mitchell or different musicians or writers, Marguerite Duras. And I wanted to kind of throw my own coming of age story into the mix, you know, humbly, very, very humbly, and say, you know, this is what it was like for me as a female artist of my generation to come of age, and hopefully that's interesting to people as well. Yeah.
Did your father ever go to Gamblers Anonymous?
He didn't. My father is very actually down on all of the AA groups, and for a while I was going to Al-Anon, or even just because I had been in this music culture, I had a lot of friends who did end up in recovery, and I would go to support them, you know, to meetings, and I found a lot of great stuff there. And my dad was like, oh my gosh, you know, that's terrible, like you're just gonna end up with all these like losers around you. And I was like, well, Dad, you know, these people are actually working on themselves and trying to come to terms with things. I mean, his hypocrisy, I think it's just his own pain. You know, he also is like an incredible cineast, like he just loves cinema, but if he finds out, even like an actress from like the 30s, he'll have a big crush on her, and then he'll find out that she was an alcoholic, and he'll like stop watching her films, as if it's like some personal failing on her part. So, you know, it's hard sometimes to like look at that, be faced with that hypocrisy, and just sort of be at peace with it. But you know, he's sort of making up his own version of life as he goes along. That said, I mean, he's very into I don't know if you're familiar with like John Lilly, who invented the isolation tank. He's like a sort of a metaphysical philosopher. He's very into a lot of writers who write about metaphysics and healing. So he's kind of doing his own work, I guess.
Sounds like he's been in denial
Yeah.
his whole life. And
Yeah.
You have a wonderful mother. I mean, what she brought you to, where she brought you, and
Yeah.
to do it alone, and the
Yeah.
environment, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's the
It's not
unfortunate.
easy to be a single parent.
Of course.
Your mom did a really good
Yeah.
job. Look where you are.
Yeah, thank you. She did, and I tried to acknowledge that in the book too. And you know, that's part of it too. Is that you know, I try to write. And there are times in the book, times in my life which I write about in the book when I was really struggling and was close to ending my life and was having issues with my own just wellness or lack of wellness, I guess. And I always was really struggling with this. And you know, my dad had never abused me physically. I had never suffered from like starvation or all these, you hear horrible stories about things that kids go through, and yeah, I had this real trauma, and I had
Emotional abuse.
Yeah, that's strong.
So I had a hard time overcoming that, but I feel really grateful that I've come as far as I have at the age that I am, and I think about my dad, you know, that he's possibly approaching the end of his life because of his cancer diagnosis and the way he's handling it, and I don't know that he has, and so, you know, that's something that's really between him and himself, and you know, I try to just sort of let him be on his path. And
I mean, I'm sure they have medical insurance in the state he's in.
yeah, yeah, it's his choice, so it's hard.
Does your father know you wrote the book? Has he read it? Have
Yes.
you talked to him about
Yes.
what is in it?
Yeah, so the very typical of my father, when I sold the book, which, you know, was about 20 years from the time that I declared I'm going to be a writer when I was 16 to selling this book, even longer than that, 23 years. And I had achieved some success as a journalist and as a ghostwriter, but I had never had a book that was like my book with my name on it. And so when my publisher offered it to me, I called my dad and I said, Dad, I sold a book and it's about our relationship. And he said, I always knew we'd write a book together someday. And so I said, well, Dad, I'm going to need your help, but it's not your book, it's my book. The good thing is that I did interview him, and I have digital tapes or digital recordings of that, which it was hours of conversation that I didn't even need for the book, but it'll be nice that I'll always have that I can share with my sister. He is an incredible storyteller, so there was some stuff from his own past that was interesting to put in there. And so then as I finished it, I was a little bit nervous about showing it to him. But he liked the attention. I mean, he's a self-proclaimed narcissist, so that's like the best thing you can do is write a book about a narcissist. So I read it, or I gave it an early copy, and he had some factual corrections. I had said he took acid 150 times, but he wanted me to make it clear he only took acid 120 times. That was very important to him. But other than that, he was really proud of me. He said it reminded him of Jack Kerouac, which was like the best compliment he could give me. And he did say, do you think I'm mentally ill? Because that's sort of a question I raised in the book. And I said, I don't know. I'm not prepared to diagnose you. And then he said, do you think I'm enlightened? And I said, well, I think you're having an enlightened response to this book. So, he's been supportive, and that's incredible because, I think that's part of it too. If you've ever not had a voice in your family, and then you have the opportunity to, sometimes it's very hard for them to hear it or to see it. And the fact that he read it, to me, was incredible because all I ever wanted him to know was the damage he had done. And the person I was, really, and he saw that in the way that he could. So I feel
And
really
what was
grateful.
his reaction to that then?
He's very good at sort of compartmentalizing things and moving on. So, I had given him a copy like in a Word document, and so then when I, when I first showed him the book, he started to just read the jacket, which starts talking about, just about my father, John, compulsive gambler, wannabe mystic, acid head, and he kind of closed it and was like, this is really hard for me to read, I have a lot of shame. So, I think he knows it's out there, he hopes it does well for me, he hopes that it helps my career, but I don't know that he wants to talk about it anymore, really.
You don't think he might ever want to write his own memoir?
He has written a lot. I mean, he wanted to be a poet, so...
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think he writes a lot of kones and little poems and things like that. So I think in some ways, also I put a lot of his letters in here because it was hard. I mean, when you only see someone 8 times and you're trying to write a book about your relationship, there's not a lot there. And so this is interesting, actually, Melissa, at our event, she had brought a lot of letters from her mother who was absent from her life. And she read some of them, and I read one of my dad's letters from the book because he has a great voice. I mean, he really is very entertaining. So I appreciated being able to put his writing in the world a little bit, as well as using it to kind of tell the story during the times when he wasn't actually present. Anyone else?
Did you ask, did you tell him beforehand that you were going to write a book about him?
I did, and also I had gone back to New York to write the book. This was in early 2013. I had a friend who was very ill, and then my dad also, had sort of been newly diagnosed with cancer, and so I just thought it would be nice to be on the East Coast and be close to him. And so I was seeing him about once a month, and as I said, doing the interviews with him, and he was always very interested. He was like, "You're great at interviewing people. I'm getting kind of addicted to being interviewed by you," and I was like, "Uh-oh," But I think in some ways it did bring us closer together. So.
This is actually off subject a little bit, but I forgot to mention about the ghostwriting. Can you
Oh,
talk a little bit about the ghostwriting?
Sure. So once I moved to Los Angeles, I was starting out as a music critic, which was great. I mean, the Los Angeles Times is an incredible newspaper, has incredible arts coverage, and then they went bankrupt, and they cut their space, and they cut what they could pay their freelancers, and so I was really struggling. I was tutoring and catering and not making ends meet, and a friend of a friend had been a ghostwriter, and she started teaching meditation instead, a very California story, and she only wanted to do health and wellness ghostwriting, not sort of the more tawdry celebrity ghostwriting. So she offered a book to our mutual friend who didn't want to do it, and so I said, oh, I'll try, and that was my first book. That was in 2008, And you know, it was sort of unlikely. It was this woman named Tila Tequila, who was a bisexual reality TV star at the time, and it was her sort of guide to dating and life. But the thing that was incredible was she really wanted to write a book. You know, there's lots of much easier ways to get your point across. You know, writing a book is actually hard work, even if you have help. And it was published by a division of Simon & Schuster. So I was working with an editor who had edited a pop culture writer named Chuck Klosterman, who I was a big fan of. And so I'm like working with this incredibly gifted editor who works with really talented, successful writers. And I thought, oh, I'm actually a writer. And like, I get to work with great people. And so it's actually been a really gratifying career. And also, most of the people I've worked with, you know, even though they have sort of a celebrity story, have dealt with, you know, spousal abuse or like actual physical abuse from their parents, you know, drug addiction, all sorts of stuff. So I really was well prepared when I started writing my book because I had seen all different types of people go through their experience of telling their story, and I'd help them. So it's great to be of service to people and to be producing books, even if they're not the books that my mom, who's a librarian, can actually buy for her library. She has not stocked a single one of my books yet. The subject matter is not quite appropriate, but it's still fun.
We'll have to see if we have Tila Tequila here, but maybe not.
Probably not, because it came out in like 2009. But you know, there might be some of my books on these shelves. I can't really say who they are, but you know, 2 of the books were New York Times bestsellers, so it was incredibly gratifying to, you know. Again, my lifelong dream since I was 16 to be a writer, and so you see a book you wrote on the New York Times bestseller list, and it feels good.
What was your mom's reaction to your book?
She had a harder time with it. I think I was the type of person who dealt with my pain by becoming a perfectionist, and I really had this idea, you know, as I say in the book, that if I was just good enough and smart enough and sweet enough, my dad would come back. And so I always was very driven in my life, and I had a lot of self-destructive behaviors that I kept very hidden, and I also went away when I was 15. So I think it was really hard for my mom to know like how heavily I was drinking as a teenager, how unhappy I was. She knew that I had had like a near suicide attempt, but it still was really hard for her to see it all on the page. But I think also she hadn't really seen me before, and once she did, it took a little while for her to adjust, and then she's been incredibly proud and incredibly supportive. So, bless you. And again, you know, my mom's a librarian and a great reader. I mean, that's partly how I came to love books. So to write a book and have my mom read it is really gratifying. So I feel lucky to have had the opportunity. Yeah.
How do you split the income from the books when you ghostwrite something?
Oh, it all depends. Usually the more famous the person is, the more clout they have in the negotiations, as works always. But I have an agent in New York who has worked at a lot of different talent agencies, so he has a lot of connections. And usually, you know, producing a book is pretty expensive because it takes a long time. So usually a client will wait until they've sold their book, and then they get sort of an advance from the publisher, and they use that to maybe take a little time off. Sometimes, you know, if they're starring in a lot of movies or TV shows, they might need a little window to kind of do interviews with me, or they might schedule it, you know, at a time when they're sort of in between their show that they're filming or something, and then they'll usually use part of their advance to hire a ghostwriter. But it really depends. I mean, there's a lot of different types of contracts. Yeah.
I think it's interesting about the ghostwriting, because when I was reading the book, I know writing personal essay, it's, you know, there's like the point where you tell the story, but then you have to somehow get to the truth of the story. You know, what is it about? And it feels to me like the ghostwriting maybe, I mean, could you have written that book before ghostwriting, or do you feel like the ghostwriting helped you get that, maybe that distance to be able to get the perspective?
I think that the ghostwriting helped a lot. I mean, even though I always wanted to be a writer, it's a lot different to want to do it than to do it. And I think also being a journalist helped a lot. It was interesting, I just got interviewed in Portland, Oregon by a woman who's like a DJ on the rock radio show, Kink FM, or rock radio station, and she said, I love books written by journalists because they just say what it is. And she's like, oh, other books, it's like, 10 sentences about the clouds and you don't even know what's going on. And I was like really precious. I had studied fiction in college at sort of like an esteemed like liberal arts college on the East Coast, and I knew how to write those short stories where like nothing happens, and like the character has like a lot of like internal movement. And I think it was really good for me to go and again be of service to people like as a journalist and as a ghostwriter. But it is really interesting that you say that about like kind of trying to bridge the gap. Like when you're writing a personal essay or even a memoir, you have to kind of, everyone's like, well, what's the point? Like, what are you going to teach me about life? Like, you're telling me all this really personal stuff. What am I supposed to do with it? And when you're trying to help other people figure out the meaning of their personal stuff, it's kind of complicated because you're helping them to try to make connections between events. Like, oh, do you think that because your father left home, it led to this thing in your marriage, or whatever it is? And you can't put the ideas in people's heads, but you have to kind of suggest them. And there's a woman who wrote an incredible book called The Impostors Daughter, which is actually a graphic novel, and she does a lot of celebrity work. It's also about her longing for her dad, and she said she thinks she works so well with celebrities because her dad was a narcissist, and she became so good at anticipating his needs that she can really work well with narcissists. And I think that probably like my dad prepared me very well to be a ghostwriter. So I think so. Anyone else? Well, thank you so much. What a great night.